December 24, 1841, Baton Rouge Parish, Louisiana. The smell of burning flesh mixed with Christmas pine would haunt the bayou for generations. Elijah, that was the name of the man who, on the holiest night of the Christian calendar, turned 7 plantation houses into funeral pyres, and their masters into screaming monuments to justice delayed but never denied. The air hung thick with humidity even in December, Spanish moss dripping like funeral shrouds from ancient oaks that had witnessed too much suffering. Somewhere in the distance, church bells rang for midnight mass while closer to the river. Screams pierced the night air like prayers answered by a vengeful God. Elijah Washington, 28 years old, 6 feet of corded muscle and quiet rage, hands that could birth a calf or snap a neck with equal gentleness. Those same hands that had been forced to build the wealth of white men for 15 years now held the tools of their destruction. He wasn't born to be a killer. He was trained to be a blacksmith, taught to shoe horses and mend plows. But fire recognizes fire, and the flames that danced in his forge had always whispered secrets about what burns and what endures. They would remember this night. Not just the planters who would die choking on smoke and their own cruelty, but their wives, their children, their neighbors who thought themselves safe behind walls built on the backs of the enslaved. 7 names written in ash and ember: Colonel Marcus Beauregard, Judge Harrison Whitmore, Captain Lucien Thibodeau, Reverend Silas Cromwell, Dr. Edmund Fairfax, Master Theodore Blackwood, and Magistrate Bartholomew Cross. 7 men who had taken everything from him. 7 men who would learn that some debts can only be paid in blood and flame. This is the true story of Elijah Washington, the slave who refused to die quietly and chose instead to drag his oppressors into hell on the night Christians celebrate the birth of their Savior. Before we continue with the video, drop a comment telling us where you're from and what time it is over there. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel. The Beauregard plantation stretched along the Mississippi like a green cancer, its white columned mansion rising from manicured grounds that had drunk the sweat and tears of 3 generations of enslaved souls. Morning mist rose from the river, carrying with it the sounds that marked another day in paradise built on human misery. The crack of whips, the shuffle of bare feet on dirt paths, the low moan of work songs that sounded more like funeral dirges. Elijah moved through this world like a ghost with substance. His massive frame bent over the forge that glowed like a mouth to hell in the pre-dawn darkness. Sparks flew from his hammer strikes, each blow precise and measured, shaping iron the way this place had tried to shape him. But iron, once heated and beaten enough, becomes stronger. Men, Elijah had learned, could follow the same principle. He didn't speak much, never had, even as a child. The other slaves called him Silent Eli, not out of mockery but respect. When Elijah Washington finally opened his mouth, it was because he had something worth saying. Most days he just listened to the conversations the white folks had when they thought he was just another piece of property. Listened to their plans, their fears, their casual cruelties discussed over mint juleps and Sunday prayers. Colonel Beauregard's voice carried across the yard as he discussed business with his overseer, Jonas Pike. "The Washington boy's getting too comfortable," Beauregard drawled, tobacco juice staining his white whiskers. "Slaves start thinking they're craftsmen instead of property. They get ideas. Ideas are dangerous in a nigger." Elijah's hammer never missed a beat. Strike, heat, strike, turn. His dark eyes reflected the forge fire, but his face remained stone. He'd heard these conversations before. They always ended the same way, with pain designed to remind him of his place. Judge Whitmore visited that afternoon, his black carriage rolling up the tree-lined drive like a hearse come early. The judge was thin where Beauregard was fat, cruel where the colonel was merely indifferent. Whitmore had a reputation for creative punishments, ways of breaking slaves that left them functional but destroyed something deeper. Marcus, Whitmore's voice was silk over razors. "I hear your blacksmith's been teaching some of the younger boys his trade. Can't have that. Next thing you know, they'll think they deserve wages." The 2 men laughed, the sound echoing across the yard where children played between the slave quarters, their laughter innocent and doomed. Elijah watched them through the smoke of his forge. These babies who didn't yet understand that their joy was borrowed time. that this place would crush them the same way it had crushed their parents and grandparents. That evening, as the sun painted the sky the color of dried blood, Elijah walked the quarter-mile to his cabin. It was smaller than the chicken coop, barely 8 feet square, but it was his. Inside, scratched into the wooden wall, where no one would think to look, were 7 marks, 7 tallies, 7 promises he'd made to shadows in the dark. Sarah's. Mark came first. Sweet Sarah with her laugh like water over stones, who'd shared his bed and his dreams until Judge Whitmore decided he needed a house girl. Sarah, who'd lasted 3 months in that house before they found her hanging from the old oak, her neck snapped like a wishbone, her spirit finally too broken to bend anymore. Then came little Moses, just 7 years old, who'd burned to death in the gin house fire that everyone knew wasn't an accident. Captain Thibodeau had been drinking that day, angry about something, and when Moses spilled molasses on his boots, well, accidents happened around upset white men. Mary's mark was carved deepest. His sister, his blood, who'd tried to protect. Her own daughter from Dr. Fairfax's wandering hands. They'd both disappeared one night, sold downriver, the doctor claimed. But Elijah had found Mary's dress in the swamp, torn and bloody, and he knew what kind of sale that had been. The other marks belonged to his father, his mother, his Uncle Thomas, and baby Grace. All gone, all taken by these 7 men who ruled this corner of Louisiana like gods dispensing death. 7 people who'd loved him, trusted him to protect them, and he'd failed them all. The mark for each one cut into wood, the same way their loss had cut into his soul. Elijah didn't pray anymore. Prayer was for people who still believed in justice, from above. But he did make promises to those marks on the wall, whispered vows in the darkness that sounded like wind through Spanish moss. He promised them fire. He promised them screams. He promised them that their deaths would not go unanswered. The planning had taken months. Elijah was patient the way water is patient, wearing down stone 1 drop at a time. He watched, he listened. He learned the routines of 7 households, the habits of 7 families, the weaknesses in 7 seemingly impregnable fortresses of white supremacy. Beauregard drank himself unconscious every Tuesday and Friday. Whitmore kept a loaded pistol in his desk drawer but never carried it. Thibodeau beat his slaves on Sundays after church, working himself into righteous fury that left him exhausted. Cromwell, the Reverend, had a taste for young boys that he satisfied in the church basement. Fairfax performed his examinations of slave women alone in his medical office. Blackwood traveled frequently, leaving his plantation in the hands of overseers who cared more about drinking than security. Cross, the magistrate, held court in his home every Thursday, dismissing his servants early so he could count his bribes. In private, 7 men, 7 patterns, 7 opportunities. The tools came together slowly, carefully. A blacksmith had access to many things: hammers, tongs, chains, fire. But Elijah needed more than tools. He needed timing. He needed darkness. He needed a night when the community would be distracted, when screams might be mistaken for celebration, when the smell of smoke could hide among Christmas cooking fires. Christmas Eve, 1841. Perfect. The forge had been his altar for preparation. Each night after his work was done, Elijah shaped his instruments of justice. 7 iron spikes, each one forged with a specific purpose, sharpened to points that could pierce bone. 7 lengths of chain, links welded to hold against any struggle. 7 small ceramic pots filled with a mixture he'd learned from watching. The gin house burn, whale oil, turpentine and sulfur. The smell of hell in earthenware containers. But more than tools, Elijah needed something else. He needed to stop being property and become something new. Something harder than iron, hotter than forge fire, more patient than death itself. The transformation began 3 weeks before Christmas, on the night they brought him news of Grace. Grace hadn't been a baby when they took her. She'd grown into a beautiful young woman, 16 years old, with eyes like her grandmother's, and a smile that could light up the darkest cabin. Magistrate Cross had bought her from a plantation in Mississippi, ostensibly as a house servant. But Cross's tastes were well known among those who paid attention to such things. The news came from a runaway who'd stopped at their quarters on his way north. Grace was dead, had been for months. Cross had used her until she broke, then buried her in an unmarked grave behind his stable like a worn-out mule. Elijah listened to this news without expression, thanked the runaway with food and directions to the next safe house, then walked calmly to his cabin. Once inside, with the door latched and his back against the wall, he finally let the sound come. Not crying. Elijah Washington had forgotten how to cry years ago. This was something deeper, rawer. The sound a man makes when the last human part of him dies and something else takes its place. When the sound stopped, when the silence filled his cabin like smoke from his forge, Elijah knew what he was. He was no longer enslaved. He was no longer even fully human. He was justice wearing a human shape, retribution walking on two legs, the answer to prayers that had gone unanswered for too long. That night, he carved Grace's mark into the wall, next to the others. 8 marks now, 8 reasons to set the world on fire. December 24th arrived with unseasonable warmth and a sky the color of old blood. The plantations hummed with nervous energy as slaves prepared Christmas feasts for their masters, while trying to ignore the irony of celebrating the birth of a savior in a land that crucified the innocent daily. Elijah worked his forge as always, but his movements had changed, economical, purposeful. Each hammer blow fell like a clock counting down to midnight. The other slaves felt it too, something electric in the air like the moments before a storm breaks. By evening, the preparations were complete. 7 houses marked for destruction. 7 families who would learn what their slaves had always known, that safety was an illusion, that terror could come knocking at any door. That being on top of the world meant you had farther to fall. Elijah bathed in the river as the sun set, washing off the coal dust and sweat of his last day as property. The water was cold, shocking his skin, reminding him that he was still alive, still breathing, still capable of feeling something other than rage. That feeling wouldn't last long, but for these few moments, standing naked in the Mississippi with Spanish moss curtaining him from the world, he remembered what it felt like to be human. Then he dressed. Black pants, black shirt, soft-soled boots. That wouldn't make noise on wooden floors. Around his waist, a leather belt that held his tools. The spikes, a coil of thin wire, a small hammer, and 3 of the ceramic fire pots. The other 4 pots waited in strategic locations, hidden during his months of careful preparation. At full dark, when the Christmas celebrations were reaching their peak and white families were settling into their false security, Elijah Washington became something new, something necessary, something that would make this night legendary in whispered stories, passed down through generations of the oppressed. He started with Blackwood. The plantation sat furthest from the others, isolated by pride and paranoia. Master Theodore Blackwood trusted no one, liked no one, and had made enemies of all his neighbors through his particular genius for cruelty. His isolation would work against him tonight. Elijah approached through the cypress swamp, moving like shadow through shadow. The house loomed white and ghostly in the moonlight, its columns like the ribs of some massive beast that fed on human suffering. Light spilled from the windows where the Blackwood family celebrated their Christian holiday, probably never sparing a thought for the families they'd destroyed to pay for their feast. The kitchen was separate from the main house, connected by a covered walkway. Smart design to prevent cooking fires from spreading, not smart enough to prevent other kinds of fires. Elijah slipped inside through the kitchen door. Locks were luxuries slaves weren't expected to understand, so most weren't particularly complex. The room smelled of roasted pork and cinnamon, Christmas plenty built on Christmas suffering. He found what he needed quickly: lamp oil, cooking oil, anything that would burn fast and hot. The first fire pot went into the kitchen pantry, nestled among sacks of flour and sugar that would feed the flames like prayers feed hope. The second pot found its way to the root cellar beneath the house, where winter vegetables waited in neat rows that would soon char into black monuments to justice delayed. But Elijah wasn't just an arsonist. Fire was too impersonal, too quick. Theodore Blackwood had earned something more intimate. The master's study occupied the ground floor, its French doors opening onto the garden, where slave children had once played, before Blackwood decided their laughter disturbed his concentration. Now the room held ledgers full of human transactions, books that reduced souls to dollar amounts, and suffering to acceptable losses. Blackwood sat behind his mahogany desk, counting money by lamplight. Gold coins caught the flame and threw tiny suns across his florid face. He was drunk, Christmas whiskey making his movements clumsy, his awareness dull. Perfect. Elijah stepped out of the shadows like judgment taking physical form. Blackwood looked up, his alcohol-soaked brain taking long seconds to process what he was seeing. "Boy, what are you—" The words died as Elijah's hand closed around Blackwood's throat. Not to kill, not yet, just to silence, to show who had the power now. "You remember Grace?" Elijah's voice was barely a whisper, but it carried the weight of graveyards. "Little girl, 16, you sold her to Cross." Blackwood's eyes bulged, recognition and terror warring in his drink-addled mind. He clawed at Elijah's hand, but 15 years of forge work had made those fingers stronger than iron shackles. "She died screaming your name," Elijah continued, his voice conversational now, like discussing the weather. "Wondering why you sent her to hell for the price of a good horse." The first iron spike went through Blackwood's left hand, pinning it to the desktop with a wet sound like splitting fruit. The scream came then, high and shocked, the cry of someone who'd never imagined pain could visit him in his own sanctuary. "That's for Grace," Elijah said simply. The second spike transfixed Blackwood's right hand. "That's for Moses." Spike by spike, Elijah nailed Theodore Blackwood to his own desk, each iron point driven through flesh and bone with the precision of a craftsman who understood his tools. 7 spikes, 7 names. 7 people who would never see another Christmas because of the man who now writhed like a pinned insect, his screams echoing through the house where his family slept. "Please," Blackwood gasped when his voice returned. "Please, I have children." "So, did I," Elijah replied. He pulled out the small hammer, the same one he'd used to shape horseshoes and mend plows. "So did Sarah. So did Mary. So did Grace." The hammer fell with the measured rhythm of a blacksmith working iron, but this iron screamed. When Theodore Blackwood finally stopped moving, Elijah set the first fire. The flames caught in the kitchen, spread through the connecting walkway, climbed the walls like hungry ghosts seeking vengeance. By the time the family woke to smoke and terror, the house was already a furnace. Elijah didn't stay to watch them burn. He had 6 more stops to make before dawn. Captain Thibodeau lived closest to Blackwood, his plantation house a monument to military precision and casual brutality. The captain prided himself on running his operation like an army base, with schedules and punishments that would have impressed a Prussian drill sergeant. But armies have weaknesses, and Elijah had studied them all. Thibodeau's weakness was his pride. He kept minimal security because he believed his reputation for violence would protect him. Tonight, that reputation would be his shroud. The captain was in his study, reviewing ledgers by candlelight. Always working, always calculating, always finding new ways to squeeze profit from human misery. He looked up when Elijah entered, and for a moment, confusion replaced his usual sneer. "What are you doing here, boy?" "You killed Moses," Elijah said simply. No threats, no theatrics, just statement of fact. Thibodeau's hand moved toward his cavalry saber, but Elijah was faster. The chain wrapped around the captain's throat like a metal snake, cutting off air and words. Thibodeau thrashed, his face turning purple, his eyes bulging with the terrible understanding that his slaves had found a new kind of courage. Elijah didn't speak during the strangling. There was nothing left to say. Moses had been 7 years old, guilty of nothing but spilling molasses on a white man's boots. Some deaths required conversation, others just required completion. When Captain Thibodeau stopped struggling, Elijah arranged the body in the chair, hands folded as if in prayer. Then he set the fire. This one burned fast and bright, the captain's military precision extending even to the organization of his flammable possessions. From Thibodeau's plantation, smoke rose like a black prayer against the Christmas stars. Judge Harrison Whitmore lived in town, his house a fortress of respectability that had witnessed more justice denied than a dozen courtrooms. The judge's home sat behind iron gates and brick walls, protected by locks and legal immunity that had never failed him. But locks meant nothing to a blacksmith, and legal immunity had no power over fire. Elijah found Whitmore in his library, surrounded by law books that had been used to justify every atrocity ever committed in Louisiana. The judge was reading by firelight, probably reviewing cases where he'd sentenced runaway slaves to death or free blacks to slavery on technicalities. "Judge," Elijah said, stepping from the shadows between the bookcases. Whitmore looked up, his thin face immediately hardening into the expression he wore when passing sentence. "You're trespassing, boy. That's a hanging offense." "So is murder," Elijah replied, "but you call it justice when you do it." The judge reached for his desk drawer, but Elijah was already moving. The wire loop settled around Whitmore's neck like a legal noose, tightening with the patience of appeals that would never come. "Sarah," Elijah whispered as he pulled the wire tight. "You remember Sarah? Pretty girl, worked in your kitchen until she decided death was better than your justice." Whitmore's hands clawed at the wire, his face purpling, his breath coming in. Wet gasps. But Elijah had learned patience from 15 years of slavery. He could wait for justice the same way he'd waited for freedom. When Judge Harrison Whitmore finally stopped moving, Elijah arranged him slumped over his desk, face down, in a law book that had probably condemned a dozen innocent souls. The fire started in the library, feeding on justice denied and cases perverted, spreading through the house like legal precedent through a corrupt system. 4 down. 3 to go. Dr. Edmund Fairfax's medical practice occupied the ground floor of his mansion, where he'd performed examinations that had nothing to do with medicine and everything to do with power. The good doctor had a reputation for thoroughness, especially when his patients were young slave women who had no choice but to submit to his care. Elijah entered through the medical office, past examination tables that had witnessed more violation than healing. The doctor was upstairs, probably celebrating Christmas with his family, blessing the bounty that came from others' suffering. But Elijah didn't go upstairs. He waited in the examination room, among the tools that Fairfax used to hurt rather than heal. The doctor would come down eventually. He always made late-night visits to his office when his wife thought he was checking on patients. The wait stretched toward midnight, but Elijah had learned patience. He'd waited 15 years for this night. A few more hours meant nothing. Dr. Fairfax descended the stairs near midnight, medical bag in hand, probably heading out to some emergency that would conveniently take him away from his family until dawn. His face went white when he saw Elijah, waiting in his sanctum. "What do you want?" Fairfax demanded, but his voice shook like a guilty man's prayer. "Mary," Elijah said simply, "and her daughter, Rebecca. You examined them both before they disappeared." The doctor's hand moved toward a cabinet where he kept surgical instruments, but Elijah was faster. The examination table that had been used for so much violation became the doctor's final resting place, leather straps designed to hold struggling patients, now holding their tormentor. "Please," Fairfax gasped as Elijah secured him to the table. "I never meant—" "You meant everything," Elijah interrupted. His voice was calm, conversational, like discussing the weather. "Every touch, every violation, every moment of power you took from women who couldn't say no." The surgical instruments that Dr. Fairfax had used to harm became the instruments of his judgment. Elijah worked with medical precision, understanding anatomy the way a blacksmith understands metal. Where to cut to cause maximum pain, where to avoid to prevent unconsciousness. The doctor's screams echoed through the house, mixing with Christmas carols drifting from nearby celebrations. When the screaming finally stopped, Elijah set the fire among bottles of medical alcohol and ether, chemicals that burned like the souls of the violated seeking vengeance. 3 houses now burned against the Christmas sky, their smoke rising like incense from an altar of justice. Reverend Silas Cromwell's church stood next to his house, both structures monuments to hypocrisy, wrapped in holy words. The Reverend preached salvation on Sundays, while practicing damnation the rest of the week, his basement confessional serving purposes that had nothing to do with forgiveness. Elijah found him in the church, kneeling before the altar, in what might have been prayer or guilt. The Reverend looked up as Elijah approached, candlelight playing across his face like flames from hell. "My son," Cromwell began, his voice carrying the authority of someone who'd never been challenged. "You shouldn't be here. This is God's house." "Then God should know about what you do in his basement," Elijah replied, his voice echoing in the empty sanctuary. Fear replaced authority on the Reverend's face. "I don't know what you mean." "Little boys," Elijah said simply. "Children who trusted you because you wore God's robes while doing the devil's work." The confession booth became Cromwell's final sanctuary, its small space filled with his muffled screams as Elijah administered judgment with tools blessed by fire instead of holy water. The Reverend died clutching his Bible, its pages soaked with the blood of innocents finally avenged. The church burned beautifully, its steeple collapsing like a prayer, answered by something darker than heaven. By now the fires were visible across the parish. Alarm bells rang from distant plantations, and riders spread the word that something unprecedented was happening. 7 of the most powerful men in Baton Rouge Parish were dying tonight, and their slaves were nowhere to be found. But Elijah wasn't hiding. He walked openly between burning houses, his face illuminated by flames that painted him like an avenging angel. People saw him, other slaves, poor whites, even plantation owners fleeing their homes. They saw him and knew that something fundamental had changed in their world. Fear was walking among the masters. Fear of their own slaves, fear of their own cruelty returned tenfold, fear of a justice they couldn't buy or legislate away. Colonel Marcus Beauregard's house burned last and brightest. The plantation owner who'd owned Elijah for 15 years, who'd spoken about him like property, while planning to break him like a stubborn horse. Beauregard had started this by deciding that Elijah was getting too comfortable in his role as blacksmith. Tonight he would learn what discomfort really meant. Elijah found Beauregard in his study, drunk and defiant, even as smoke filled the air and screams echoed from his neighbors' houses. The colonel held a shotgun, its barrel trained on the door, waiting for whatever demon was collecting his friends. "Evening, Colonel," Elijah said, stepping into view. Beauregard's face went through several changes: surprise, recognition, understanding, and finally, a kind of grudging respect. "You should have killed you years ago," he said, not lowering the gun. "Yes," Elijah agreed, "you should have." The shotgun blast echoed through the house, but Elijah was no longer where he'd been standing. 15 years of moving carefully around. White men's violence had taught him to anticipate, to be elsewhere when death came calling. The colonel never got a chance to reload. Elijah's hands, strengthened by years at the forge, closed around Beauregard's throat with the finality of judgment, long delayed. "For all of them," Elijah whispered as the light faded from Beauregard's eyes. "For every soul you bought and sold and broke." Marcus Beauregard died in his chair, surrounded by ledgers that calculated human worth in dollars and cents. His house burned around him, the flames consuming 15 years of Elijah's enforced servitude and transforming them into something clean and final. 7 fires now painted the Louisiana sky, their smoke rising like prayers from a different kind of altar. Christmas Eve 1841 had become Judgment Day for 7 men who'd thought themselves untouchable. But Elijah Washington wasn't finished. The final fire pot waited in his cabin, along with something else. A letter, written in the careful script he'd learned in secret from stolen books and hidden lessons. The letter that would make this night more than simple revenge, that would transform 7 murders into something larger. He lit the letter with flame from his final fire pot, watching his words catch and spread. "To whoever finds this, my name is Elijah Washington. I was property. Now I am justice." 7 men died tonight because they forgot that slaves are human beings with human hearts and human capacity for human rage. They died for Sarah, for Moses, for Mary, for Rebecca, for little Grace, for my father and mother, for every soul they broke while wearing the mask of civilization. Let their deaths serve as warning to any who believe that power gives them the right to treat other humans as less than human. Some debts can only be paid in blood and fire. Tonight, Christmas Eve 1841, those debts came due. Let any who would be masters remember, we are not property, we are not animals, we are people, and people have breaking points. I regret nothing except that I waited so long." The letter burned in his hands, but not before other hands had copied. Its words passed them along the secret networks that connected slave communities across the South. By morning, even before the ashes cooled, Elijah's letter was being whispered in quarters and hidden camps, shared by riders on the Underground Railroad, treasured by those who'd never dared imagine that slaves could strike back so completely. Authorities found Elijah at dawn, sitting calmly in the ruins of his cabin, surrounded by the ashes of his final fire. He didn't resist arrest. He'd accomplished what he'd set out to do. 7 debts paid, 7 fires lit, 7 messages sent to every slaveholder in Louisiana that their property might not remain property forever. The trial was swift, the verdict predetermined. Elijah Washington would hang for the murders of 7 prominent citizens, but the trial also provided a platform, a chance for his story to spread even further. Newspapers across the South reported his calm demeanor, his refusal to show remorse, his simple statement when asked if he had anything to say before sentencing: "I am not sorry they are dead. I am only sorry I could not save the ones they killed." He died on February 14, 1842, Valentine's Day, with a crowd of thousands watching. Some came to see justice served. Others came to witness the death of something they couldn't name but recognized, the birth of a new kind of resistance, a demonstration that even the most oppressed could become oppressor when pushed beyond human endurance. But death couldn't contain what Elijah had unleashed. His story spread through the South like wildfire, whispered in quarters, sung in work songs, passed down through generations as both warning and inspiration. 7 fires on Christmas Eve became legend, proof that even in the darkest night of oppression, justice could still burn bright. The Christmas Eve fires of 1841 changed something fundamental in the relationship between master and slave across Louisiana. Plantation owners slept less soundly, treated their human property with slightly more caution, remembered that the hands that built their wealth could just as easily burn it down. Other slaves found courage in Elijah's story. Small rebellions increased. More slaves attempted escape. Some even succeeded, carrying with them the knowledge that they were human beings with human rights, not property to be used and discarded at will. The legend grew over time, embellished by each telling, but never straying from its essential truth. That Christmas Eve 1841, a slave named Elijah Washington had looked evil in the face and burned it away, proving that justice delayed might be justice denied, but it was never justice forgotten. Today, in the parishes around Baton Rouge, old families still remember the night the fires burned and Christmas became Judgment Day. They remember because some stories are too powerful to forget, too necessary to let die. They remember because Elijah Washington's legacy wasn't just 7 dead slaveholders. It was the knowledge that every human being, no matter how oppressed, carries within them the capacity to say no more and make it stick. If this story haunts you, it's because it should. Evil prospers when good people do nothing, but sometimes it takes someone willing to become something harder than good, to make evil pay its debts. Subscribe and share with those who need to remember that resistance has many faces, and sometimes the face of justice wears scars from the forge and blood on its hands.